The dust was a constant film on everything in Harmony Gulch, a fine, gritty layer that settled on the rough-hewn planks of the boardwalks, coated the skeletal branches of the scarce trees clinging to the dry slopes, and seeped into the very marrow of those who lived there. Alara knew its taste intimately, a bitter reminder of a life stripped bare. Winter was beginning its slow, cruel siege. The wind, already carrying the bite of the coming cold, whipped through the gulch, rattling loose shutters and moaning around the corners of the small, tired buildings. Her cabin, perched precariously on the edge of town where the land began its steep, inhospitable climb towards the snow-capped peaks, offered little respite. It was drafty, the single room perpetually dim, smelling faintly of old wood smoke and the gnawing presence of want. She huddled by the meager fire, wrapping a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, the chill outside mirrored by a deeper cold within. It had been 3 years since she'd arrived in Harmony Gulch, following Thomas with a heart full of hesitant hope. 3 years since the promise had curdled, leaving her alone with nothing but this cabin, his memory, and the heavy, dangerous knowledge he'd left behind. The secret was a physical weight in her chest, a stone that pressed down on her breath with every passing day. It wasn't hers, not truly, but it had become inextricably bound to her existence. A silent, constant threat. The town, small and isolated, felt less like a community and more like a collection of wary eyes, always watching, always judging. Their pity, when it was offered, felt like another form of scorn. Mostly, though, there was just indifference punctuated by suspicion. They saw her as damaged goods, a woman alone, outside the protective sphere of a man. And a woman alone, in a place like this, was vulnerable in ways that went beyond the biting wind or the empty larder. She survived on odd jobs, mending clothes for the saloon girls, cleaning floors when someone would hire her, her hands raw and chapped, her back aching. Each coin earned felt like a victory, a small defiance against the relentless pressure of her circumstances. But the winter was coming, a relentless, unforgiving force, and her savings were threadbare, like the shawl around her shoulders. The thought of the long, snowbound months ahead filled her with a dread so profound it sometimes stole her sleep. She wasn't afraid of the cold itself or the hunger, not truly. She was afraid of failing, of succumbing, of the secret being unearthed when she was too weak to protect it, or herself. Its exposure wouldn't just ruin her. It held the potential to shatter the fragile peace Harmony Gulch had built upon a foundation of deceit. Her gaze drifted to a loose floorboard near the hearth. Beneath it lay the proof, the tangible evidence of the lie that sustained this town's fragile prosperity. It was a burden she hadn't asked for, a legacy of Thomas's desperation and the greed of others. And she was trapped, unable to use it, unable to destroy it, unable to escape it. The sound of a horse's hooves on the frozen earth outside pulled her back from her thoughts. Not the familiar clatter of a local's tired mount. This was heavier, steadier. A stranger. It wasn't uncommon, but rare enough in the deepening cold to warrant attention. A moment later, the sound stopped directly in front of her cabin. Her breath hitched. Strangers meant questions. Questions were dangerous. She rose slowly, moving to the single, grimy window. Peering through the streaked pane, she saw a horse, a sturdy bay, tied to the hitching post, and standing beside it, a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, clad in a long, duster-style coat that offered protection against the elements. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the glint of metal on his chest, a badge. A lawman. Her blood ran cold. Marshals didn't often come to places like Harmony Gulch unless there was trouble. Real trouble. And trouble, for her, always led back to the secret. He stood there for a long moment, unmoving, simply observing the cabin. His stillness was unnerving. He didn't look like the local sheriff, a corpulent man more interested in the saloon's takings than justice. This man had an air of quiet competence, an authority that came not from bluster, but from something deeper. He turned his head slightly, and though she couldn't see his eyes beneath the hat brim, she felt the weight of his gaze as if he could see right through the glass, through the walls, into the hidden corner of her life where the secret lay buried. A shiver, unrelated to the cold, traced a path down her spine. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't called out. He was just there, a silent sentinel. A man of the law standing outside her door, in a town built on a lie she alone could expose. The crisis she had long feared felt suddenly, terrifyingly, imminent. He was still there the next day. And the day after that. Marshall Thorne. She learned his name from the hushed whispers that rippled through the gulch. He didn't make a spectacle of his presence. No grand pronouncements in the saloon. No rounding up of the usual suspects. He moved through the town with a quiet deliberation, observing, listening. He spoke little, asked questions that seemed innocuous on the surface but carried an undercurrent of persistent inquiry. And he watched her. Not constantly, not obviously, but she felt his gaze upon her at unexpected moments. When she was hauling water from the communal well, her shoulders aching, she'd glance up and find him across the dusty street, standing near the general store, his eyes on her. When she left the saloon after delivering mended shirts, his figure would be outlined against the setting sun down the street, watching her walk home. It was not the predatory stare of men who saw her as easy prey. It was different. It was assessing, patient, like a hawk circling, noting every movement. Her fear of him was not the sharp, immediate fear of violence, but a creeping dread that he represented the inevitable uncovering, the force that would strip away the layers of her carefully constructed, fragile existence. She tried to avoid him, to make herself smaller, less noticeable. She went out at different times, took longer routes. But the gulch was small, inescapable. His presence was a tightening net. Her internal monologue became a constant negotiation with panic. What does he know? She would ask herself silently, her hands trembling as she threaded a needle. Has someone talked? But who could talk? The men involved in Thomas's scheme were the powerful ones. The pillar, they didn't like him. He was an unknown quantity, a disruption to their carefully maintained order. This gave Alara a sliver of something she couldn't yet name. Not hope, certainly not trust, but perhaps a lessening of absolute dread. He wasn't with them. That much was clear. He was apart. One evening, as she was leaving the general store, her arms laden with a small sack of flour and some dried beans, the wind snatched her shawl, sending it billowing into the dusty street. She fumbled, trying to catch it, her precious supplies threatening to spill. Before she could react, a large hand reached out, corralling the errant fabric against the wind. Thorne stood beside her, his face unreadable beneath the hat brim. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray she noticed for the first time, met hers for a brief instant. There was no smile, no greeting, just the simple, practical act. He released the shawl back to her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. His touch was unexpectedly gentle. "Wind's picking up," he said, his voice low, quiet, like the murmur of distant thunder. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. His gaze held hers for another moment, steady, inquiring. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly and continued on his way down the street, his long coat flapping around his legs. She stood there, clutching the salvaged shawl, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone else. But in a town where kindness was a rare and suspect commodity, especially towards her, it felt monumental. It complicated her fear of him, blurring the sharp edges of her dread. Was this a tactic? A way to disarm her? Or was there something else beneath the stoic exterior? She didn't know, and the uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the fear itself. His quiet observation had shifted, subtly, into a presence that felt both threatening and, in that single brief moment, unexpectedly protective. The unspoken language of Harmony Gulch was one of averted gazes, tight-lipped silence, and gestures that spoke volumes. Alara was fluent in it. She saw the way men straightened their backs a little too rigidly when Marshall Thorne passed, the way conversations died abruptly, the way the saloon owner, Old Man Hemlock, wiped down his bar with unnecessary vigor whenever Thorne was near. They knew he was watching and they didn't like it, and they knew, or suspected, that his interest wasn't merely in petty disputes or public drunkenness. He was looking deeper. His method was not intimidation, but persistence, a quiet refusal to look away. He didn't demand information. He simply existed, an unwavering point in the shifting, uneasy landscape of the town's secrets. His interactions with Alara remained minimal, yet they were freighted with a significance that hummed just beneath the surface. He would appear on the edge of her awareness, a silent sentinel. Once, she was splitting firewood, the small axe unwieldy in her hands, the wood stubborn and frozen hard. Her breath plumed in the cold air, and frustration coiled in her gut. She swung the axe awkwardly, the blow glancing off the log. A sudden, sharp pain shot up her arm. She cried out softly, clutching her hand. When she looked up, Thorn was standing perhaps 20 yards away, near the path leading into the woods, watching her. He didn't move towards her, didn't call out. He simply stood, his gaze steady. His expression was, as usual, unreadable, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his posture, that felt like concern, pity. She couldn't tell. But his presence felt different from the usual indifferent or mocking stares she received. It felt like a silent acknowledgement of her struggle, a stark contrast to the town's dismissiveness. She quickly recovered herself, forcing her injured hand to grip the axe again, determined not to show weakness. She managed to split the stubborn log on the next try, the effort sending a fresh wave of pain through her arm. When she looked up again, Thorn was gone. He hadn't offered help, but his silent witness felt like a form of it. It was the absence of judgment she felt most keenly. Other townsfolk saw her struggles as evidence of her inability, her weakness as a woman alone. Thorn simply observed, without comment, without condemnation. It was unsettling, this lack of expected reaction. It chipped away at her defenses, forcing her to question the rigid framework of fear she had built around herself. She was so used to expecting the worst from people, especially men with authority. But Thorn didn't fit the mold. He was a lawman, yes, but he seemed unbound by the local allegiances, the quiet corruption that was the lifeblood of Harmony Gulch. She saw him talking to the sheriff again a few days later, near the general store. The sheriff was doing all the talking, gesturing expansively, his face flushed. Thorn listened, his expression impassive, occasionally asking a short question that seemed to cut through the sheriff's bluster. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the sheriff's discomfort, the way he shifted his weight, avoided Thorn's direct gaze. Whatever Thorn was investigating, it made the town's authority figures uneasy. This reinforced Alara's sense that his presence was connected to the secret, that he was digging in places the powerful men of the Gulch didn't want disturbed. And she held the key, the volatile truth that could either help him or bury them all, including her. The space between her fear of him and her tentative, reluctant acknowledgement of his different nature widened. The secret felt like a burden she carried alone, a weight that pressed her down. But sometimes, when she felt his steady gaze upon her from across the street, the weight felt fractionally lighter, as if its existence was, for a fleeting moment, shared, or at least acknowledged by another soul in this desolate place. The pillars of Harmony Gulch's society were men like Cyrus Holt, the saloon owner, whose cheerful demeanor barely masked a shrewd, grasping nature. Silas Croft, who owned the general store and controlled credit, thus holding the livelihoods of many in his hand. And Sheriff Brody, whose badge was less an instrument of justice and more a tool for maintaining the status quo that benefited Holt and Croft. These men had built their modest prosperity on the back of the gold unearthed years ago. Gold that had, according to Thomas, been acquired through less than legal means. It wasn't just the theft. It was the claim jumping, the intimidation, perhaps even worse. Thomas had stumbled upon the truth, and his discovery had been his undoing. Now Alara held the proof, a detailed map and a signed confession hidden beneath the floorboard. It documented the original claim, the names of the rightful prospectors who had been run off or worse, and the undeniable signatures of Holt, Croft, and a now-deceased third party, detailing how they had conspired to steal the claim and the initial haul. This was the foundation upon which their little kingdom was built, revealing it would not only expose their crime but also potentially invalidate their land claims, their businesses, everything. It would throw the town into chaos, pit neighbor against neighbor, and likely lead to violence against those who had benefited, and against the one who revealed the truth. This was why Alara stayed silent. It wasn't just fear for herself, though that was a cold, sharp thing. It was a weary understanding of the destructive power of the truth in a place like this. It wouldn't bring Thomas back. It wouldn't fix her life. It might only unleash more ugliness, more pain. She had seen enough ugliness. She wanted only to survive the winter, to perhaps find a way out of this gulch, to disappear and leave the secret buried forever. But Thorne's presence made that increasingly difficult. He didn't just observe, he disrupted. She saw him speaking to Old Man Miller, the town's unofficial historian, a man whose memory was long but whose tongue was usually guarded by fear. Thorne wasn't pressing him. He was simply listening, patiently. She saw the sheriff grow increasingly agitated, his visits to the saloon more frequent, his voice louder. Holt and Croft seemed to be in constant, hushed conversation. They felt the ground shifting beneath them. Alara felt it too. Their fear was a palpable thing, and she knew, instinctively, that cornered animals were the most dangerous. She caught Holt watching her from the saloon doorway one afternoon, his usual jocular expression replaced by a hard, assessing stare. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Suspicion, calculation. He knew she was connected to Thomas. Did he suspect she knew more? Croft, usually distant and formal, stopped her on the boardwalk the next day under the pretense of asking if she needed anything from the store. His eyes darted around nervously as he spoke, his questions straying beyond supplies, asking about her well-being, her plans for the winter, whether she kept in touch with anyone from Thomas's past. The questions were too pointed, too casual. They were circling. They were beginning to see her not just as a widow to be pitied or ignored, but as a potential threat. Thorne's investigation, quiet as it was stirring the murky waters of Harmony Gulch's past, and the sediment rising to the surface contained the dangerous truth she held. She felt caught between the quiet pressure of the lawman and the rising fear from the men who controlled the town. The space beneath the floorboard suddenly felt less like a hiding place and more like a ticking clock. The weight of the secret was no longer just a personal burden. It was a force pulling her towards an unavoidable confrontation. The moments of tentative trust were small, fragile things, easily shattered by the harsh reality of the gulch. But they were there, tiny sparks in the encroaching darkness. One biting cold evening, Alara found her water barrel frozen solid, the ice too thick to break with her usual tools. Hauling water from the well in this weather was a brutal chore, made worse by her still aching arm. As she stood there, contemplating the frozen barrel with a weary sigh, Thorne appeared as if from nowhere. He carried a heavy axe, one much sturdier than hers. Without a word, he walked over to the barrel. His movements were economical, strong. With two swift, powerful blows, he shattered the thick ice, freeing the water beneath. He didn't look at her as he did it. He simply completed the task, handed her her own small axe, and turned to leave. "Marshall," she managed, her voice raspy with cold and surprise. He stopped, turning back slightly. His eyes met hers in the dim light. "You need water," he said, stating the obvious with quiet finality. There was no expectation of thanks, no lingering. He simply provided the necessary help, saw that she was capable of managing now that the ice was broken, and resumed his silent patrol. It was a simple act of practical kindness, devoid of fanfare or ulterior motive that she could discern. It wasn't flirting, wasn't pity. It was just help. In Harmony Gulch, help usually came with a price, a favor owed, an expectation. Thorne asked for nothing. This unexpected decency chipped away further at the wall she had built around her heart. She was so used to men wanting something from her or wanting her gone. Thorne seemed to want nothing, or perhaps something she didn't yet understand, something unrelated to the usual transactions of power and need in this town. The contrast between his quiet competence and the blustering insecurity she saw in the sheriff, or the calculating smiles of Holt and Croft, was stark. She started to watch him, too, albeit discreetly. She saw him sit with Old Man Miller for hours, listening patiently to the rambling stories of the town's early days, sifting through the nostalgia for fragments of truth. She saw him walk the less trodden paths outside of town, examining old, abandoned claims. He was thorough, methodical, and he wasn't finding what he was looking for in the obvious places. The truth, she knew, was hidden, just like the proof beneath her floorboards. Her fear of him began to mingle with a grudging respect, and perhaps a flicker of hope. If he was truly a man of justice, a man not beholden to the rot that infested Harmony Gulch, perhaps the secret wasn't a purely destructive force. Perhaps it could be something else. But the thought was terrifying. To reveal it would be to step out of the shadows, to make herself a target. It would mean placing her life, her future, in the hands of this quiet, stoic stranger. It was a leap of faith she didn't know if she was capable of making. The town's fear of Thorne was growing palpable. The saloon was quieter in the evenings. The poker games were less rowdy. Holt and Croft seemed permanently etched with expressions of tense concern. They knew he was getting closer, circling the truth, even if they didn't know how close he was. And Alara knew, with a sickening certainty, that their fear would soon translate into action. Their discomfort was her countdown. The pressure mounted subtly at first, like the slow accumulation of snow before a blizzard. Croft started refusing her credit at the general store, despite her always having paid her debts. "Times are hard, Alara," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "Can't be extending credit like before." Not to everyone, the implication hung heavy in the air. She was disposable, non-essential, easily cut off. Then Mrs. Gable, whose dresses Alara often mended, suddenly found she had no more work for her. "My niece, she's come to stay," Mrs. Gable explained, her voice overly sweet, her eyes flicking past Alara's shoulder as if afraid of being seen talking to her. The small, vital threads connecting Alara to the town's economy, tenuous as they were being systematically cut. They weren't confronting her directly, not yet. They were isolating her, making her existence in the gulch unsustainable. It was a common tactic, effective in a place where survival depended on a fragile network of services and tolerances. Without work, without supplies, she would be forced out, or worse, become utterly dependent and controllable. She knew this was Holt and Croft's doing, a quiet squeeze designed to break her. Their fear of Thorne's investigation was escalating, and they clearly saw her as a potential weak point. They couldn't touch Thorne directly, but they could apply pressure to those they thought might be connected to whatever he was looking for. Her past connection to Thomas, his sudden death years ago under vaguely suspicious circumstances, officially a mining accident, but whispered otherwise, made her a logical target for their fear. The harsh environment itself seemed to conspire with them. The snow began to fall earlier than usual, thick, heavy flakes that blanketed the gulch, making travel difficult, isolating them further. The cabin became a tomb of cold and silence. Her supplies dwindled rapidly. The gnawing fear of hunger, of freezing, became more immediate than the fear of the secret being exposed. But the secret was the reason for this pressure. They suspected she knew something, perhaps not the full truth, but enough to be dangerous if Thorne's inquiries led him to her. The heavy plank beneath the floorboard felt like a magnet, drawing danger towards her. One afternoon, as she struggled to clear the snow from her doorway, a figure approached through the swirling white. It was Holt's foreman, a burly man named Jedediah, whose face was usually set in a perpetual scowl. He stopped a few feet away, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Holt sent me," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. "Says he needs that cabin cleared out. Wants to use it for storage." Alara's heart leaped into her throat. "Cleared out? But I live here." "Holt owns the land now," Jedediah said flatly. "Bought it from Thomas's estate after he passed. Said he let you stay for a while, but time's up. Be gone by week's end." It was a lie. Thomas had owned the land outright, and Holt had never let her stay. She had simply remained here, unnoticed, for years. This was not about storage. This was eviction, a deliberate act of cruelty designed to leave her exposed and desperate in the face of winter. It was a clear message. They wanted her gone permanently, Jedediah waited for a reaction, his eyes finally meeting hers, a cold, hard look in them. Alara straightened, gripping the shovel handle. "Tell Holt I'm not leaving," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her knees trembled. Jedediah's scowl deepened. "He ain't gonna like that. That's his concern," she replied, meeting his gaze squarely. He stared at her for another moment, then spat in the snow and turned away, trudging back towards the town. The confrontation, albeit indirect, had begun. They weren't waiting for Thorn anymore. They were making their move. And she was alone, facing eviction and ruin, with nothing but the secret and the increasing certainty that her time in Harmony Gulch was running out, one way or another. The secret wasn't born of her own actions, but forced upon her by circumstance and the cruel hand of fate. Thomas, her husband, had been a dreamer, restless and full of schemes. He wasn't a bad man, not truly, but he was easily led, easily swayed by the promise of quick riches. When he stumbled upon evidence that the richest claim in Harmony Gulch, the one that had jump-started the town's growth and filled the pockets of Holt, Croft, and their partner, wasn't legally theirs, he hadn't seen danger. He'd seen opportunity. He believed he could use the information to leverage a share, to finally provide Alara with the security he craved. He had confided in her, showing her the crumpled map, the hastily written confession. He had been so full of nervous excitement, so certain this would be their salvation. Alara had felt only a cold dread. She had seen the kind of men Holt and Croft were, the quiet ruthlessness beneath their veneer of respectability. She had begged Thomas to leave it alone, to burn the papers, to forget what he knew. But his ambition, his desperation, had blinded him. Then had come the accident in the mine, a cave-in that seemed just a little too convenient, too final. The sheriff had barely investigated. Holt and Croft had offered their condolences, their expressions solemn, their eyes calculating. Alara had inherited the cabin, little else, and the terrifying knowledge that Thomas had hidden the proof somewhere within its walls, intending to retrieve it later. Grief had been a paralyzing fog, but fear had been a sharp, constant companion. She had found the papers months later, tucked into a hollow space beneath the floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth. Seeing the names, the details, understanding the scale of the lie the town was built upon, she knew instantly why Thomas had died. And she knew she was in danger. Burning the papers felt like betraying Thomas, like rendering his death meaningless. Giving them to the sheriff was unthinkable. He was clearly complicit. Trying to leave with them was too risky. She would be tracked, stopped. So she hid them again, deeper, and tried to live a life as small and invisible as possible, hoping the secret would remain buried with her husband's memory. But the secret was not content to stay buried. It pulsed beneath the floorboards, a dangerous heartbeat in the quiet cabin. It dictated her every move, fueled her isolation, shaped her into the wary, silent woman the town saw. It was the ghost of Thomas's fatal ambition, a weight she carried alone. Now, with Thorn's arrival and the increasing pressure from Holt and Croft, that weight had become unbearable. The eviction notice was the final turn of the screw. They weren't just trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to eliminate her presence, to ensure that if Thorn's investigation ever did uncover the truth, she wouldn't be there to confirm it, to provide the missing piece only she possessed. She understood their logic. Without the papers, her story was just the word of an unreliable, isolated woman against the pillars of the community. But with the papers, it was undeniable. The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the sounds of the gulch, creating a suffocating silence that magnified the turmoil in her mind. She couldn't stay. They would find a way to make her leave or worse. And she couldn't leave without the papers. The secret was hers now, a part of her burden. She looked at the loose floorboard, then towards the window, seeing the faint outline of the town lights through the swirling snow. Thorn was there, a lawman who didn't fit, who seemed to possess integrity in a place where it was a foreign concept. Her fear of him warred with a desperate, burgeoning hope. He was the only path she saw, the only slim chance of facing down the powerful men who were closing in. But trusting him, giving him the secret, felt like stepping off a cliff. It meant giving up the only leverage she had, the only protection the secret itself offered by remaining hidden. It meant placing her fate entirely in his hands. Thorn appeared at her cabin 2 days after Jedediah's visit. The snow lay thick on the ground, silent and deep. He didn't knock loudly, just a firm, measured rap on the door. Alara hesitated for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The quiet observation, the subtle acts of unexpected kindness, the rising tension in the town. It had all led to this. She opened the door a crack, the cold air rushing in. Thorn stood on her small porch, snow dusting the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his coat. His face was impassive, but his gray eyes held a familiar, unwavering intensity. "Alara," he said, his voice low. It was the first time he'd used her name. "Sheriff tells me Holt's laying claim to this cabin. Says he wants you out. It wasn't a question." He knew. He knew about the pressure, about the eviction attempt. He knew they were targeting her. "He doesn't have the right," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. "Thomas owned this land." Thorn's gaze was steady. "Holt says the records show different. Says the claim passed to him." "He's lying." The words were out before she could stop them, sharp and defiant. Thorn nodded slowly, as if this was confirmation of a long-held suspicion. He didn't press her on the lie, didn't ask how she knew. He simply absorbed her statement. "A lot of things in this town aren't what they seem, Alara," he said, his gaze sweeping across her face, taking in her exhaustion, her fear, the stubborn spark of defiance in her eyes. "I've been here weeks now, asking questions, listening. The story of how this town got its start has got too many holes. Too many folks with secrets they're afraid of seeing the light." He paused, letting his words hang in the cold air between them. The subtext was a roaring wind. He knew there was a secret. He knew she was connected to it. He wasn't demanding she reveal it, not yet. He was showing her he understood the landscape, that he saw the pressure she was under, and that he saw her. "Holt and Croft are powerful men," he continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight. "They don't like loose ends. And they seem to think you're a loose end, Alara. Especially with me asking questions." He stepped closer to the door, lowering his voice further. "They tried to run you off. What happens when that doesn't work? What happens when winter sets in, and you're still here and I'm still here?" It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a stark outlining of her precarious position. He wasn't forcing her to talk, not with physical coercion or threats of arrest. He was forcing her to confront the reality of her situation, the rapidly narrowing options, the inevitable collision course she was on with Holt and Croft. He was presenting the choice not as revealing the secret to him, but as choosing a path forward from an untenable present. She could try to weather the storm alone, facing the escalating attacks from the town's powerful men with dwindling resources and no protection. Or, there was another way. His gaze remained steady, patient. He wasn't going to make the choice for her, but his presence, his quiet understanding, the implicit promise of the badge on his chest. It was all part of the equation he was laying bare before her. The cabin felt suffocatingly small, the air thick with unspoken words and years of fear. The floorboard beneath her feet felt suddenly hot, a live coal. The secret felt less like a shield and more like the very thing drawing the wolves to her door. Thorn didn't need to say it. His presence, his words, the context of the town and the looming winter spelled out the choice with chilling clarity. Continue hiding and risk everything alone, or place her trust in this unknown quantity, this quiet lawman, and face the consequences, whatever they might be, with him standing beside her. The silence stretched, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. The choice was agonizing, a battle fought in the silent space behind her eyes. To reveal the secret was to invite chaos, to expose herself fully to the wrath of men who had shown they were willing to kill to protect their lie. It meant dredging up a past she desperately wanted to leave buried. It meant trusting a man she barely knew, whose quiet integrity was the only fragile bridge across the chasm of her fear. But to remain silent was a slower death. It meant facing Holt and Croft alone, enduring their escalating cruelty, watching her life unravel until she was broken or gone. It meant allowing Thomas's sacrifice, however misguided, to be utterly in vain. It meant living forever under the weight of the secret, a ghost in her own life. Thorne waited, his patience a heavy presence. He didn't look away, didn't prompt her. He simply stood there, a point of stillness in her storm. His presence felt different now, not just the authority of the law, but something that resonated with the quiet strength she had glimpsed in his actions, the mended ice, the silent witness by the woodpile. He wasn't part of the rot. He was an external force, one perhaps strong enough to withstand it. She thought of Thomas, his hopeful, doomed face. She thought of the rightful owners of the claim, run off or worse, their lives stolen by greed. She thought of the town, built on a lie, its people living in a false reality sustained by the corruption of its leaders. And she thought of herself, withered by fear, hiding from a truth that deserved to be seen. The choice was not just about her survival anymore. It was about dignity, about reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost in the fear and the hiding. It was about honoring the truth, even if it came at a terrible cost. Slowly, deliberately, Alara pushed the door open wider, inviting him in. The small gesture felt monumental, a crossing of a threshold she had guarded fiercely for years. Thorne stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of cold air and damp wool. He closed the door softly behind him, sealing them inside the dim cabin, away from the eyes of the gulch, away from the falling snow. The silence between them was different now, charged not just with tension, but with a shared understanding of the gravity of the moment. Alara walked past him, her movements stiff with resolve, and knelt by the hearth. Her fingers, calloused and chapped by the cold, found the edge of the loose floorboard. She glanced back at Thorne. He watched her, his expression still unreadable, but his gaze was steady, expectant. There was no turning back. Taking a deep breath that hitched in her throat, she pried up the board. The small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle lay nestled in the dirt beneath. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly. This was it. The tangible proof. The hidden heart of the secret that had shaped her life for the past 3 years. The volatile truth that could destroy the town and potentially destroy her. As she picked up the bundle, the sound of angry voices, muffled by the snow, reached them from outside. Heavy footsteps crunched on the frozen ground approaching the cabin. Alara, we know you're in there. Holt's voice, rough with fury, pierced the quiet. Open up. We need to talk. Croft's voice joined in, equally menacing. We know what you're doing, woman. You can't hide from us. They hadn't waited. They knew Thorne was here. They knew the time for subtle pressure was over. They were coming for her, for the secret. Alara looked at Thorne, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp fear. His face remained calm, but his hand went instinctively to the butt of the pistol on his hip. Looks like your choice was made for you, he said quietly, his voice devoid of judgment, simply stating the dangerous reality. But the choice of how to face it, that's still yours. The knocking started, heavy and demanding, rattling the flimsy door on its hinges. The cabin door shuddered under the impact of their fists and boots. Holt and Croft, fueled by fear and desperation, were abandoning all pretense. Alara clutched the oilcloth bundle to her chest, her mind racing. She had brought Thorne in, had been moments away from revealing the secret to him, and now the very men the secret implicated were outside, demanding entry. Thorne moved swiftly and silently, positioning himself near the door, his hand still resting on his pistol. He didn't draw it yet, his posture one of measured readiness, not aggression. Marshal Thorne is in here with me, Alara called out, her voice stronger than she expected, fueled by a surge of defiant adrenaline. The pounding stopped abruptly. A tense silence fell, broken only by the wind and the heavy breathing on the other side of the door. They hadn't expected him to be here, not inside the cabin with her. His presence complicated their plan, but their fear had pushed them too far to retreat easily. Thorne! Holt yelled, his voice shifting from bluster to wary calculation. "What are you doing in there? That woman's got no claim to that property." "She's under my protection," Thorn replied, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the door. "Step away from the cabin, Holt." Croft, his use of their names, devoid of title or respect, was a quiet assertion of his authority, of his outsider status and lack of allegiance to their local power structure. A low murmur of furious consultation came from outside. They were weighing their options. A head-on confrontation with a U.S. Marshal was a different prospect than intimidating a solitary woman. But letting Alara and Thorn remain inside, potentially with the evidence, was equally unacceptable to them. "Send her out, Thorn," Croft shouted. "She's got something of ours." Thorn didn't respond immediately. He glanced back at Alara, his gaze questioning. The moment had arrived. The choice, explicitly stated by him earlier, was now stark and immediate. She could try to bluff, to deny, to prolong the standoff, but that would only invite a potentially violent breach of the door, and perhaps Thorn would not be able to protect her. Or she could fully commit to the path she had just chosen by opening the door to him. She looked at the oilcloth bundle, then at Thorn's resolute figure guarding the door. This wasn't just about the papers anymore. It was about standing firm against the forces that had tried to silence and erase her. It was about the truth and the slim chance of justice Thorn represented. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I have proof that this land, and everything you built on it, was stolen. Proof of what you did to Thomas, and to others." She raised her voice, projecting it towards the door, towards the men who listened outside. "Marshal Thorn is here to see justice done." A roar of outrage erupted from outside. The door rattled violently as they renewed their assault, fueled by rage and panic. "You lying whore!" Holt shrieked. "We'll burn you out." Thorn didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer loud in the small cabin. "Holt! Croft! This is your only warning. Disperse, or I will consider it an assault on a federal officer." His voice was calm, authoritative, utterly without fear. The pounding faltered again, then stopped. There was more urgent, hushed talk outside. They were armed, she knew. They had men with them, Jedediah and others loyal to Holt. It was a dangerous gamble. But Thorn's unwavering stance, his willingness to face them down, solidified her resolve. She walked towards him, the bundle still in her hand. She didn't give it to him yet. It felt like a final, crucial step she needed to take herself. The silence outside stretched, thick with menace. Then, slowly, she heard footsteps retreating, crunching back through the snow, receding into the distance. They were gone. For now, the immediate crisis was averted, but the confrontation had occurred. The secret was no longer just hidden. It had been declared, and the fight for the truth had just begun. The aftermath was not quiet or peaceful. The departure of Holt and Croft from Alara's cabin was not a retreat born of capitulation, but a tactical withdrawal. They knew they couldn't force their way in while Thorn was present without facing serious consequences. But they wouldn't abandon their efforts to silence her. The gulch became a tense, watchful place. Holt and Croft spread their version of events, that Alara was a crazy woman, bitter over her husband's death, making wild accusations, trying to steal property that wasn't hers. Some townspeople, dependent on Holt and Croft, or simply unwilling to challenge the established order, believed them or pretended to. Others, those who had long suspected the truth, or who resented the power of the two men, watched and waited, a flicker of rebellious hope in their eyes. Thorn remained in the cabin with Alara that night, and the nights that followed. Not in a way that invited gossip, but as a silent guardian, his presence a clear message to Holt and Croft and the town that Alara was under his protection. He slept in a chair by the door, his pistol on the table beside him. Alara slept fitfully, the presence of another person in the small room both unsettling and strangely comforting after years of solitude. In the quiet hours, she finally gave him the oilcloth bundle. She watched as he carefully unfolded the map, tracing the lines of the claim, and then read the confession, his face grim and set. He asked questions, his inquiries precise, methodical. Alara answered truthfully, her voice regaining strength as she spoke the words she had kept buried for so long. Speaking the secret aloud, sharing its burden, was like shedding a heavy cloak. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was tempered by a sense of purpose, of having finally stepped out of the shadows. Thorn didn't offer platitudes or promises. He simply listened, absorbed the information, and began to formulate his plan. He couldn't just arrest Holt and Croft based solely on the documents. He needed corroboration, witnesses, official procedures. This wasn't a quick, dramatic showdown. It was a slow, deliberate process of dismantling the foundation of a town built on lies. He used the cabin as his base, interviewing the few brave souls who dared to speak to him, Old Man Miller, who confirmed details about the original prospectors, a former miner who had heard whispers years ago. Alara remained by his side, not just a witness, but an active participant, her knowledge of the town's hidden currents proving invaluable. Holt and Croft didn't remain idle. They isolated the cabin, blocking the path with fallen trees, conveniently blown down by the wind, they claimed, discouraging anyone from approaching. They spread rumors, threatened those who spoke to Thorn, making the air thick with menace. The true climax wasn't a single shootout, but a prolonged period of tension, a battle of wills and evidence waged in the heart of the harsh winter. Thorn, with Alara's help, worked tirelessly, building his case, preparing to bring in support from the nearest federal court. Alara, no longer defined by her fear or her secret, discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. Her vulnerability hadn't vanished, but it was now coupled with a quiet strength forged in the crucible of hardship and the decision to face the truth. She was no longer the woman hiding in the shadows. She was a woman who had chosen to step into the light, carrying the truth like a shield. The transformation was not just internal. The town, seeing Thorn's unwavering dedication and Alara's quiet courage, began to shift. Doubt turned into open dissent for some. The fear of Holt and Croft remained strong, but it was now matched by a growing desire for change, for a town not built on lies. The final confrontation arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet arrival of more lawmen from the nearest large town, summoned by Thorn. Seeing the official reinforcements, the power of Holt and Croft crumbled not in a blaze of glory, but in a wave of panicked attempts to flee, quickly thwarted by Thorn and his deputies. There was no romanticized gunfight, but a messy, undignified apprehension of men who had relied on intimidation and corruption for too long. The secret was out. The map and confession were damning evidence. With Holt, Croft, and their few loyal enforcers under arrest, the immediate threat to Alara subsided, though the long shadow of their influence would take time to dissipate from the gulch. The town reeled from the exposure of its foundation. There was anger, disbelief, betrayal. Families were divided, fortunes questioned. The fragile prosperity built on theft seemed poised to collapse. But amidst the chaos, there was also a sense of catharsis, of a poisonous truth finally brought into the light. Alara stood on her porch, watching the wagon carrying Holt and Croft away, a cold, clear light illuminating the scene. She felt no triumph, only a profound exhaustion and a quiet sense of completion. The weight was gone. The secret was no longer hers alone to carry. It belonged to the town now, a difficult legacy they would have to confront. Thorn remained in Harmony Gulch for a time, overseeing the initial stages of restoring some semblance of order and justice. He was still the quiet, observant man she had first encountered, but their dynamic had shifted. The tentative trust had solidified into a quiet, mutual respect, a bond forged in the shared risk and the fight for truth. There were no grand pronouncements of future together, no declarations of love. Their connection was understated, rooted in shared experience and unspoken understanding. He had facilitated her growth, not by saving her, but by providing the opportunity for her to save herself, to find her voice and her strength. He had seen her vulnerability and watched her transform into a woman capable of facing down the darkness. Alara's life didn't magically become easy. The cabin was still drafty. Winter was still harsh, and the town's future was uncertain. There were still those who resented her role in exposing the truth. But she was no longer defined by fear or the need to hide. She had faced the worst and emerged unbroken. She started to participate more in the town's life, cautiously at first. She helped those who were struggling in the aftermath, her hands still calloused, but her spirit lighter. The cabin, once a prison of her fear, felt like her home, a place where she had faced down her demons and chosen courage. Thorn eventually moved on, his duty in Harmony Gulch fulfilled. Their parting was quiet, marked by a simple nod, a long, steady look that conveyed more than words ever could. He left her not with a promise of forever, but with the enduring legacy of her own resilience, the knowledge that she had the strength within her to face whatever came next. She remained in Harmony Gulch, a woman who had been broken down by hardship and fear, only to be rebuilt stronger, more resilient. The secret had nearly destroyed her, and nearly destroyed the town, but in forcing her to make a choice, it had also forced her to find her courage. And in the quiet lawman, she had found not a rescuer, but a catalyst, a silent partner in her journey from vulnerability to enduring strength. The harsh landscape of Harmony Gulch remained, but Alara now faced it with a quiet dignity, her gaze steady, looking not back at the shadows, but forward to the challenging, uncertain, but finally hopeful light of a new day. Hope in Harmony Gulch was a fragile shoot pushing through frozen ground. The aftermath of the truth's exposure was complex. The wealth accumulated by Holt and Croft was subject to legal challenges. Restitution was a complicated, drawn-out process that brought little immediate relief to those who had suffered. Some left the gulch, unable to bear the weight of the town's revealed history or the uncertainty of its future. Others, rooted in the land and necessity, stayed, slowly beginning the difficult work of rebuilding trust and community on a foundation of honesty, however painful. Alara was among those who stayed. Her cabin, no longer under threat of false claim, remained her anchor. The floorboard was secured, the space beneath empty. The secret was gone from its hiding place, now residing in official documents and the collective, troubled memory of the town. She still mended clothes, still cleaned floors, her labor honest and necessary. The townspeople's attitudes towards her were varied. Some respected her for her courage, others resented her for the upheaval she had precipitated. But no one looked at her with pity or indifference anymore. She was a figure of consequence, a woman who had faced down the most powerful men in the gulch and survived. Her interactions were no longer limited to hushed necessity. She spoke more freely, her voice clear and steady. She helped organize efforts to support the neediest families as the winter deepened, her practical skills and quiet determination proving invaluable. The vulnerability was still a part of her history, a scar she carried, but it no longer defined her present. The resilience she had discovered was not a sudden, dramatic transformation, but a quiet, steady growth, like the slow formation of ice on a mountain lake, strong and unyielding. Her solitude was less about isolation and more about self-possession. She was comfortable in her own company, no longer haunted by ghosts or shadowed by secrets. The harsh environment of the gulch, which had once felt like an enemy, now felt more like a challenging, but ultimately surmountable, force of nature. She respected its power, understood its limits, and found strength in her ability to endure it. The memory of Marshall Thorn lingered, a quiet presence in her thoughts. Their connection had been unique, forged in shared danger and the pursuit of truth. He represented a world beyond Harmony Gulch, a wider sense of justice and order. His departure had left a space, but not an emptiness. He had fulfilled his purpose, both for the town and for her, acting as the catalyst that forced her hand and set her on a path towards reclaiming her own strength. She often stood on her porch in the evenings, watching the stars emerge in the vast, cold sky above the gulch. The future remained uncertain, the challenges many, but the fear that had once crippled her was gone, replaced by a quiet determination, a deep-seated confidence in her own capacity to endure. She had been stripped bare, faced the darkness, and found the light within herself. Harmony Gulch was her home, flawed and struggling, but now built on a foundation of difficult truth. And Alara, the woman who had hidden a secret that could destroy it, was now one of its strongest, most resilient pillars, her quiet strength a testament to the enduring power of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of the secret was over, but Alara's story of resilience was just beginning, unfolding day by day in the heart of the unforgiving, beautiful gulch.